Our next guest is the ranking member of the House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the U.S. and Chinese Communist Party. Congressman Khanna joins us this morning from Maplewood, Ohio, where he's leading a 3-day Heartland tour, visiting farms and factories. We want to get to that trip. We also want to get to the president's trip to China. But first, thank you for joining us. And I do want to ask you about that testimony on Wednesday with Howard Lutnick. You said regarding his connections to Epstein, he made a, quote, farce of the English language and that Trump would fire him if he heard what he said. And I wanted to ask you, are you sure about that? Are you sure you think the president would fire him if he knew what he said?
I am, because the president would see him sweating and mumbling and struggling to answer very basic questions. I mean, Howard Lutnick's testimony was that when he told the nation that he would never visit Epstein after 2005, that what he meant was that he himself would never visit Epstein, but it was fine for him, his wife, and his kid to visit Epstein's island. So that just makes no sense. Anyone listening to it would know he was lying, and he was not honest. That's the real issue.
I want to ask about the Epstein Transparency Act and where we are in this process. So a signal moment, having the Commerce Secretary up on Capitol Hill testifying before the Oversight Committee. There was a lot of commentary early on that the Justice Department hadn't upheld its obligations to that act. Have they since? Are you satisfied with what you've gotten from the Justice Department? And indeed, where does this investigation, in part helmed by the Oversight Committee, go from here?
Well, it's been the largest release of documents over decades, 3 million files released. And they have shown an Epstein class that feels like they don't need to live by the rules, that treats these women as dispensable. But there's still 3 million files that need to be released. And the biggest thing that survivors tell me is they want to see investigations and prosecutions. There are people who abuse them, rape them, or traffic them in these files, and there haven't been any investigations or prosecutions. So we need the release of the remaining files, and we need investigations and prosecutions.
I was also wondering, and stick with me here, it is a bit of an odd question, but I'm wondering if you have any insight into why Melania Trump, seemingly out of nowhere, made that odd and rare public appearance in April, denying any connection with Epstein and calling for Congress to bring survivors forward to testify. Do you know what prompted that?
I don't, but I actually welcomed it, because unlike her husband, who's calling these survivors a hoax, First Lady Trump is saying that they deserve to be heard. First Lady Trump is saying that there should be investigations and prosecutions. And the most important thing she said is Epstein was not alone. She knows that there were other men involved in abusing, trafficking, raping these young girls. And she is saying there needs to be an investigation. There needs to be prosecution. And she's contradicting her own husband. So what I would ask for the First Lady is to say, call on the Justice Department to release the remaining files and call on them to begin investigations and prosecutions.
Congressman Khanna, as we mentioned, this trip is coming up this week, this postponed trip the president's taking to Beijing to meet with President Xi. You're the ranking member of this committee on China. And I'm curious sort of how you see the importance of this visit and indeed what you hope will come out of it. What is a good outcome in your estimation of this trip where the leaders of the two largest economies in the world are going to meet?
Well, I've been in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan talking to our farmers, talking to our factory workers. Let me offer 4 things we need to do. First, we need to get a deal for China to buy more of our soybeans. The farmers have been hurt. They're buying now from Argentina. They're buying from South America. They're not buying from our farmers. Second, we need to make sure that they're not sending their ships to our ports without a fee. We suspended this fee, and China's using their ships in our ports that are hurting American shipbuilding. Third, we need to find some way to lower the cost of fertilizer. It's really hurting a lot of our farmers. It's hurting a lot of the food prices in the United States. That means getting them not to have export controls on that, and that means figuring out how we open up the Strait of Hormuz. And finally, we need to make sure that they're not dumping into the United States. They continue to have unfair trade practices, and we need to clamp down on that.
Historically, the Chinese have been very adept and very tenacious negotiators, especially when it comes to matters of the economy. We've been talking this morning about how the Treasury Secretary has laid the groundwork and established a relationship with his counterpart in Beijing. But I'm wondering if you think this administration, if you think President Trump is ready to go toe-to-toe with the Chinese, if he can get successfully the things you were all just talking about out of these negotiations.
Well, he hasn't shown that ability so far. Obviously, I'm rooting for him because he's the American president, but we've lost 80,000 manufacturing jobs on his watch. We've seen 316 farm bankruptcies on his watch compared to 215 the year President Biden was in office. We've seen the trade deficit for the United States actually increase. We've seen the cost of inputs increase because of blanket tariffs. So he has a lot that he has to reverse. We've had China hold us hostage on rare earths and critical minerals. I want a deal that actually helps American farmers, American shipbuilders, American manufacturers, and I hope he will work to get that. He hasn't so far.
Part of that committee's remit, as I understand it, is to look at this balance of power, this level of competition between the U.S. And China. And I'm curious how you see that dynamic at play right now. So we had just a few days ago Iran's foreign minister going to Beijing to meet with China's foreign minister. It's clear that China, by not getting actively involved in this conflict in the Middle East, is positioned, shall we say, differently from the U.S. right now. And perhaps that's something I think advantageous to the Chinese leadership. It's not a war that's draining resources from them. Sure, they'd like to have the energy that's stalled in the Strait of Hormuz. How do you see that competitive dynamic, and how worried are you about the degree to which the U.S., the administration, is paying attention to that binary between the U.S. and China?
Well, I'm concerned that we're draining our resources in a war in Iran. We haven't been able to get their enriched uranium out. Iran's regime is more hardline, with the IRGC having more control. Iran has more control over the Strait of Hormuz. It's cost us billions of dollars, and it's increased our food prices. And China basically is just watching from the sideline. They're not sinking that money into the Middle East. They're sinking that money into building their ships, into building alternative energy, renewable energy, into building their economy. So what I want is for the United States to be putting our resources in investing in manufacturing here at home, jobs here at home, research and innovation here at home, and not getting sucked into the Middle East. That's a drain of our resources.
Congressman, I do want to ask you a more armed services-y question, and that's there's this report in the Washington Post about U.S. intelligence analyzing the data and saying that Iran is situated to last at least 3 or 4 more months of this blockade before really feeling the economic pressure. When it comes to a war of attrition, if you're looking at Iran versus the U.S. versus even China, how long they're willing to sit this out, do you think the American public and people, real people who you've been talking to in the Midwest, are going to give the president the benefit of the doubt for this conflict for 3 to 4 more months, given what it's doing to prices of almost everything?
No, it's because we're spending $1 billion to $2 billion a day. But that's not just the cost. I mean, when I asked Pete Hegseth, what's the cost? He said it's a gotcha question. But Pete Hegseth may want to go out to Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania because the cost is the increased cost of gas. The cost is the increased cost of diesel. The cost is the increased cost of fertilizer. All of that means increased costs for Americans when it comes to food, when it comes to their rent, when it comes to filling up their tanks this summer. And that's not a worth in Iran that is more hardline and that still has enriched uranium. So we haven't achieved anything, and we've created enormous economic hardship on the American people. We need to end this war. We need negotiation that opens the Strait of Hormuz, allows gas, allows diesel, allows fertilizers prices to fall.
How blind are you, other lawmakers flying right now? I guess it's no small thing that the defense secretary did make his way to Capitol Hill to answer some questions, not all of them, but at least some of them. I think when we first heard about the funding request the administration was making, there was some speculation that lawmakers would welcome that as an opportunity to kind of use that to get Secretary Hegseth and others on the Hill to answer questions about this conflict, about the trajectory of this war. How much confidence do you have in your understanding of what the administration wants to do and where this war is headed?
The administration doesn't have a clear strategic goal. First, they said they wanted regime change. Now they acknowledge that the regime that's in place is actually more hardline than Khamenei. Then they said they wanted the nuclear energy out and for Iran to be denucleared. Now they acknowledge that enriched uranium is still buried under Iran's soil. Then they said, well, they want the Strait of Hormuz to be open. Well, the Strait of Hormuz was open before this war. So now we have to figure out how do we get the Strait of Hormuz open. There is no strategic goal. The strategic goal right now should be the immediate opening of the Strait of Hormuz, the end to these hostilities, not shooting at each other, so that the price of food and the price of gas can drop, and then negotiation with the international community to get Iran to commit on getting enriched uranium out and inspections, something Obama had achieved that Trump tore up.
The president has been very frustrated with European allies who've so far been unwilling to engage directly in either helping with the blockade or helping American action in the region. Part of the repercussions of that are he has now threatened to take a significant number of troops out of Germany after the chancellor had some harsh words about Trump and saying he was getting played by the Iranians. Are you concerned that that will really happen? And at what level do you worry it will impact American operational abilities? Because those are big bases. The U.S. relies on them for a heck of a lot of stuff in that theater. Why is he doing this? And are you concerned it's going to impact military readiness?
Well, I'm concerned that he's doing it in a retaliatory way. If he wants to look at lessening our footprint on our 800 bases overseas to reduce cost, that's a separate conversation. But he shouldn't be threatening the German chancellor with our troop presence in Germany because the German chancellor doesn't want to engage in a blockade that isn't being effective in the Strait of Hormuz. What we need to do is bring along our European allies, like President Obama did, to put pressure on Iran to have a deal that forces them to submit to inspection and give up their enriched uranium. Obviously, the military option didn't work. Yes, the military destroyed Iran's navy. Yes, it destroyed Iran's air force. That may weaken them regionally, but it did nothing in terms of getting them the enriched uranium out. And for that, we need our European allies, NATO, and diplomacy.
Let me pivot from the shooting war in the Middle East, shooting war in Europe, to the political war here in the United States over congressional districts. And as I said, you're uniquely positioned. You're on Armed Services Oversight, the China Committee. You're also from the great state of California, which is wrestling with some of these issues having to do with congressional districts. I'm curious what your reaction is to what we've seen in recent weeks out of Virginia, the Virginia Supreme Court ruling that the redrawn districts that were passed by voters there does not comport with the state's constitution, obviously a setback for Democrats. We saw the ruling from the Supreme Court on the Voting Rights Act. Where do you see this war, that political war, heading as we see Republicans and Democrats going back and forth on the way those congressional districts are drawn?
Well, the Virginia decision was overruling Virginia voters. I mean, Virginia voters just voted on maps. And for the Virginia Supreme Court to invalidate an election is deeply anti-democratic. And then for the U.S. Supreme Court to gut voting rights in the Deep South, to not understand that there's racially polarized voting in the Deep South is completely out of touch and undermining the efforts of the civil rights movement. I mean, they're going after Jim Clyburn's district. There was not a black member in Congress in South Carolina for 100 years between Reconstruction and Jim Crow. Jim Clyburn won that seat in 1992 because they drew a black majority district, and they're trying to eliminate that. They're trying to eliminate the work of the voting rights and civil rights movement, eliminating black majority districts in the South. It's deeply concerning, and not on a political level, just on a level of anyone who cares about civil rights and black representation in America.
So what are you going to do about this? What are Democrats going to do? And at this point, is this a map Democrats can reasonably win and hope to flip either of these bodies in November?
We're going to win the House. They will win despite all of these games. My concern is, what is this doing in terms of our civil rights representation? I would encourage people to watch Jamie Harrison's passionate defense of black majority districts in South Carolina and beyond when he spoke at the South Carolina legislative session. And I do believe that we can convince in some of these legislators not to do what they're thinking of doing, eliminating black districts. It's not right for the country, and it may actually backfire on them, creating more Democratic districts in the process. So as they eliminate black districts, they may actually be creating more Democratic opportunities. So we're going to be fighting in each one of these states to make sure that they don't eliminate these districts.
What do you say to the viewer of Bloomberg Television, the listener to Bloomberg Radio, who sees the gentleman from Fremont, California, in Maplewood, Ohio, and wonders if this gentleman has higher aspirations than representing a congressional district in California? And if you demur on answering that directly, what does the Democratic Party need to know from the places that you've been spending the last three days visiting?
I'm here in my capacity as the top Democrat on the China Select Committee, and I'm here with colleagues from Michigan, from Pennsylvania, from Ohio. But what I would say is the Democratic Party needs to spend more time in places in rural America, on farms, in factory towns, and then understand that they're upset. They're upset with both parties. They've seen manufacturing job loss. They've seen the prices increase. They've seen wealth pile up in districts like mine in Silicon Valley, while the American dream seems farther out of reach here. And we need to offer a vision. I call it economic patriotism, a new industrial bank that invests in communities, 1,000 new trade schools, a new sense of tech institutes across America, a trade agenda that actually opens up foreign markets for our farmers. So we need to offer an economic agenda for the future.
So you're exploring running for president?
Well, right now I'm exploring what the agenda for the China Committee and House Democrats should be. But I do believe whoever runs to represent our party and our nation should have a comprehensive economic agenda for the future. I think that's the central issue. How are we going to improve the lives of Americans in many of these places that were hollowed out after NAFTA, hollowed out after China came into the World Trade Organization? What is our vision for bringing them back, for having economic security and economic independence?